Okay, well, welcome back to Black Swan Outdoors, and today we're going to talk about selecting field tools. So when I talk about selecting field tools, what I'm talking about is kind of selecting tools for outdoor use. And I think that there's a lot of misconceptions or misapplication of tools based on different types of, I guess, people getting confused on kind of the use of the different tools for wilderness use, specifically with the bushcraft community, because I think that there's a lot of overlap between survival bushcraft and wilderness travel, and not always are the appropriate tools for the different kind of contexts are chosen. And so this kind of video is kind of to talk about kind of all three of these things kind of in general, to maybe help people kind of get a better idea of how to select different tools for different environments and different things. So when if I was to go on a wilderness trip, if I was going to go out canoeing for 10 days out in the middle of the wilderness, what would be the tools that I would select? If I was going to go bushcrafting over the weekend, or car camping, what would be the tools that I would select? And if I was in maybe a survival situation, what would be the tools that I would want to have with me? Well, I'll summarize pretty much everything in saying that it's not anything that you would see. My primary tool would not be anything that you see here. In fact, my primary tool would be this guy. And that's probably counter to what a lot of people say about a wilderness knife. It's probably counterintuitive, and it contradicts a lot of what people think. Well, I'll give you a reason why I would use this knife as my primary. This would be my primary tool. For one, I'm going to be spending a quality amount of time in preparation of this trip, which means I'm going to be taking the appropriate gear with me. And the gear that I'm going to have with me, I'm going to rely on as my primary shelter and cooking and so on. So I have no need for a big knife, an axe even, or even a saw. Now that's need, that's not want, and I'll get to that in just a second. But in terms of what I would actually be doing with a knife or any kind of tool, primarily are a few basic functions: opening packaging, and simple carving tasks, maybe even starting a fire, all of which I can do with a knife like this. But here's the secret. This is the thing that gives me the advantage over all the other tools: scissors. And the reason why I think scissors are key is for a couple different reasons. One is, if you've ever had to put on a moleskin, you're going to put that moleskin on in a circular shape. That's really important. Because of the rubbing, you don't want that bandage to fall off. So any kind of protection I'm going to put on myself, that's going to be rounded in shape so that it stays on. And that goes for any repair that I need to do with my gear. So if I need to fix a thermarest, if I need to put a patch on a tent or a pack, I'm going to cut a circular shape out of my extra material, whatever I'm patching it with, so that those corners don't get caught and the patch doesn't rip off. And so that's for first aid purposes. So moleskins, cutting bandages, things like that. Scissors are really, really important. The other thing that's really important about a scissors is hygiene. And so that's cutting toenails and fingernails, things of that nature. If you hadn't done that prior to your trip, you want to make sure that your toenails are trimmed, especially if you're relying on your feet for walking. But also for your hands and for the people with you on your trip, that if you're going to the bathroom, for example, out in the woods, and then you are going to cook meals, you want to make sure that you have well manicured fingernails so you're not spreading disease, because although you are going to do your due diligence in washing your hands afterwards, and you might have sanitizer and things like that, it would be beneficial to you and the rest of your group that you have short fingernails so that you aren't spreading fecal fingers, right? So to me, a small pocket knife that is lightweight, It's going to be in my pocket no matter what. It's not going to be cumbersome. It's not going to add an exorbitant amount of weight to my overall gear, and it's going to be highly functional. So I'm going to go with a survival knife, or a Swiss Army knife of any kind, really. But I want to have scissors, and this is what I'm going to kind of create my foundation for all of my travel with, because again, I'm not necessarily needing all the other tools. Now, would I want the tools? Sure, they could be handy. If I want to have a campfire, there is nothing better than camping with a campfire. So if I'm backpacking, then I'm going to select a saw. And for me, if people are looking into purchasing gear, I would start with a Swiss Army knife of something like this as my first tool, because that's going to be the most useful for most people. And then second, I would look at a saw, and not spending an exorbitant amount of money on the saw, and not getting something that's too big. One thing that's really lost in the bushcraft community that kind of underscores their lack of real wilderness travel is the lack of outdoor ethics in a lot of those videos. One of the most important aspects of outdoor ethics, or leave no trace camping, is when you're building a fire, is to focus on wood that's no bigger than your size of your wrist. So you don't want a big saw. You don't need a big saw. Now, Mors Kochanski, awesome survival and bushcraft instructor, will talk about how much wood you need in the boreal forest to keep warm in a survival situation. That's one thing. That's something completely different than the reality of what most people live. So a lot of times people focus on these big, you have to have a 36-inch buck saw, or you have to hide the blade in your belt, and none of that makes sense for 99% of people. For his specific situation and his specific location, that makes sense. And a lot of YouTube or other videos and blogs conflate or misappropriate the tools for the different situations. So what I'm saying is a cheap, relatively cheap saw. Why is cheap? Well, for one, I can't sharpen these blades. These blades are, the way that it's manufactured, I can't sharpen them. So this is basically a disposable tool. When it becomes dull, why buy something that, if I could sharpen the blade, it makes more sense to spend a little bit more money. But to be honest, I've had this tool, this Gerber, for probably, I don't know, maybe close to 20 years now, and it's fucking fine. It works. It's fine. It's not great, but it does what it needs to do. And it wasn't expensive, and it's light enough. I carry this on the back of my portage pack, so that if I need to get to, like if I'm paddling down a river that's not cleared, I have the ability, a tool to get to. You know, if I know that I'm going to do some heavy sawing, then I'm going to bring a bigger buck saw. But for the most place, this is where I'm going to go. The next tool I might look at is some kind of fixed blade or sheath knife. And this is going to, the reason why I'm going to go into this is, or the functionality of this is that this is for firecraft and building fire. It's a little bit more functional. I can do a lot more with this knife. I can clean fish. I can do more kitchen tasks. And for most campers, most even bushcrafters, most people that are in the out of doors, or all people in the outdoors, are, for any extensive amount of time, are obviously going to have to eat. And if you're preparing meals, if you're cleaning fish, if you're hunting, if you're doing a little bit of everything, you're going to want to have some kind of sturdy fixed blade knife, whether it be in the kitchen or, you know, whatever. Would I take this backpacking? Probably not. I mean, depends on the type of food that I might be packing. Would I take this canoeing? Maybe, yeah. That'd be fine. Would I use this for bushcraft stuff in a backyard or a state park or whatever? Absolutely. It's fine. But again, I'm not going to want to go into anything much heavier. You know, a tool like this, whether I'm backpacking or canoeing or anything, doesn't make sense. Because if I'm going to carry something like this, I might as well carry the next tool, which is a hatchet. So I'm just going to move these aside. The hatchet can do, an axe in general, can do everything that a saw can do, and more. So if you're going to spend the money on something nicer, I would spend the money on a higher quality axe. And that's not only going to be safer for you, but it's going to be much more functional. Now, here's my caveat, or here's my caution. Most people getting their tutorials online, and I'm not trying to be critical on this, but they do not, most instructors and most people do not underscore how dangerous an axe is in the wilderness environment. A hand axe like this is very functional. I can build fires, I can build shelters, I can do many, many things with something like this. However, the risk of exposure to a mishap with a tool like this is extremely high. So if you are not very comfortable with using an axe in the especially in the wilderness, you are much safer and better off not taking this with you. Now, that being said too, if you're out in the wilderness, it's been raining for 3 days, you need to get a fire going because you're risking hypothermia, or you've ran out of fuel, or whatever, for emergency purposes, you need to, split open a piece of wood to get to the dry wood to get a fire started, or whatever the scenario is. You lost all your gear and you need to build a shelter, emergency shelter. There's probably no better tool than an axe. Now, a hand axe is cut down in size because it's more functional. It can be on your hip if you need it, or you can put it in a backpack or whatever. But reality is these are cumbersome, they're heavy. There's not anything I would personally take on a wilderness trip. But if I did need to do something, I would take something with a little bit longer of a handle, like this Grand Forks Brooks. It's a nice compromise. These are all the rage. Everyone loves them. They're great. They have a great utility. Every bushcrafter and big YouTube personality from, I don't know, Wrangler Star to Ray Mears has an axe like this. That's fine. And these are very popular, and they're functional, and I get that. That being said, for most people that are not doing wilderness travel all the time, are going to want something like this because it's going to split wood better. This doesn't split wood as great. It works great for limbing trees. It's great for maybe making a shelter. It's much safer because it has a longer handle. I would opt for something like a boy's axe. It's going to be a little bit heavier, a little more cumbersome, but it's going to be even safer than something like this, and it's going to split a lot better. That's just my preference. Now, if you do go out in the wilderness quite a bit and you use a lot of axe, you do a lot of axe work. Here I have on my property, I use this thing quite a bit. If you're doing bushcrafting as a skill, and you probably might want something like this. The advantage of an axe like this is in the profile of its design, that you can use it as in a lot of functionality, or a lot of crossover between a knife. So you wouldn't have to necessarily have a big knife if you have an axe like this, because the profile of the grind is much, much thinner than something like this. So this axe is going to be much heavier, but it's going to split wood better because that wider, that more obtuse angle. This is going to skin, carve, pretty much do a lot more. So it's lighter. It's actually larger axe, but it's lighter overall than something like this. I don't know all the specs off the top of my head. But I would just say, these axes are the last thing you want to get into, and the last thing you want to consider, especially if you're going out into the wilderness, because they're just so dangerous. They really are, even for skilled people. I've been using axes for many years, and I've cut myself with an axe. I nearly took my thumb off, actually, and out just being stupid. It was getting dark. I was hungry. I felt rushed. It was all of the scenarios that you need to tell yourself, stop what you're doing and relax and start thinking about what you're doing instead of just trying to get tasks done. And that happens in many different scenarios. So, okay, another thing, I see a lot of people love machetes. And this isn't a machete, this is a kukri. And it's a great tool, great for, for a lot of different tasks, clearing brush and this and that. And that's why I have it. great for, you know, getting material ready for fire starting. It has a lot of functionality, but really in a wilderness use, it doesn't do much. Now, if I live down south in, like, you know, a place where machetes are more common because you're not harvesting wood, you're harvesting, you know, foliage, or you're needing a knife like something like this to cut trail, that kind of thing, to move through, you know, that certainly makes sense. But a lot of times people buy these big freaking knives, but they serve absolutely no purpose at all. It's just heavy and weight and cumbersome. If you're going to carry, again, if you're going to do some chopping, then you're better off with an axe. Get the tool that's best for the environment that you're in. I did a video on survival knives. You can watch that, and we talk a little bit about what I'm talking about here. And then lastly is, I see a lot of people with these tomahawks. These things suck ass. Are they fun to throw around and play around with? Yes. Am I going to be out in the woods splitting skulls? Absolutely not. So this is not a wilderness tool. This is more of a toy than anything. It's not functional. You know, do, you know, awesome, you know, special forces guys carry some of these? Yes. Does that mean it's applicable in your environment? No, it doesn't. So to kind of recap, you know, you'd really want to select the tools for your skill level. You want to select the tools for your environment. But I think that oftentimes people underrate the functionality of using a small, simple Swiss Army knife like this because of all of the extra sex appeal. That there's this great kind of mythic notion that I'm going to be able to go out and with my survival knife in the woods and survive. You know, I have my SE5, and I can do everything with this, and I need nothing else but this knife to survive in the woods. And that's just a recipe for disaster. I think that knives are handy to have, but you should be able to do a lot of things in the woods without a knife in general. But I've backpacked hundreds of miles of trails, canoed hundreds of miles for multiple, you know, week-long trips, carrying nothing but a Swiss Army knife, and I've been totally fine because I've relied on my gear. I've relied on my clothing and layering system. I've relied on my 10 essentials, and I've relied on my navigation skills. And I've never needed a survival knife or been in a drastic survival situation for that reason. Kind of an honorable mention, and the knife that I carry quite a bit too is this guy here. This is it's a locking Swiss Army knife. So I have a little more advantage because I have a little bit more blade. So in the kitchen, cleaning fish, things like that, this is much more advantageous. It's safe because it locks, which I like. It's got the nylon handle, so I have a little bit more grip. But here's the thing. Getting into a peanut butter jar with something like this is ridiculous. So preparing lunch on the trail with something like this is way more functional and effective. So the only other thing too is sometimes and often I'll on longer canoe trips I'll carry a Leatherman tool because I like the pliers. They're nice for, you know, picking up, you know, as an extra pot holder or pulling stakes out of the ground and things like that. But really, a Leatherman tools, to me, multi-tools aren't as functional in a wilderness environment. You know, if you've got a knife like this that comes with a saw, you know, great. And I think there's a version of this that does have scissors, I think. Also, the awl is very handy for making repairs. You know, can openers aren't as popular or useful anymore as they used to be back in the days. So, you know, if they just got rid of these guys and threw in a pair of scissors, this would be a perfect outdoor knife. But that's just me dreaming. This is kind of going on long, but I hope you enjoyed this video. If you've got any comments, that'd be great. Like and subscribe. We're doing more knife videos shortly.